We think of international terrorism, when somebody talks about terrorism, we typically think of international terrorism, but domestic terrorism is also a very, very huge problem for any state to handle, right? Not just the United States of America, but any state has great, great problems subsiding and pacifying domestic terrorism. The next is what's known as bargaining-dependent terrorism, right? Now, this is a very technical concept, and I'll go through and explain it. Unless you are familiar with sort of international relations or conflict resolution at the international level, it's probably the case that you've never heard this concept, so I'll explain it in detail. It's known as bargaining-dependent terrorism, right? So this is bargaining bargaining dependent, emphasis on dependent terrorism. And this is what it is. Bargaining dependent, and you can follow along, dependent terrorism is an approach to terrorism wherein the perpetrators use human life, resources, and anything of value, right? So they'll use people, they'll use buildings, they'll use anything that has any value to extort those in power to meet their demands, right? So for example, a bargaining dependent terrorist activity would be kidnapping, hijacking, seizures, and so on, right? So as an example, bargaining dependent terrorism would be kidnapping, what do we say? Kidnapping, hijacking, etc., etc., right? So seizures, kidnapping, hijacking, these are all forms of bargaining dependent terrorism. We recognize now that the terrorist activity, right, this is important, the terrorist activity is contingent. It depends on bargaining, right? So then you will have a very skilled international negotiator, hostage negotiator, maybe a Fed negotiator that will come in and negotiate the terms of the terrorist group or individual, right? So in the case, just for example, in a kidnapping, obviously the main incentive, not always, but the main incentive for kidnappers will be monetary, right? So a kidnapper might want ransom. Insofar as ransom, right? Insofar as ransom, for example, insofar as ransom is the goal of the terrorist group or individual, then that act of kidnapping the individual becomes bargaining dependent, because then it's really up to the negotiator to determine the terms of this ransom, right? You want $1 million, we can't get $1 million, we can get $375,000 if you let her go or let him go. They go back and forth, back and forth. The individual either receives the money or doesn't receive the money, something happens, but the terms of the terrorist activity is contingent on bargaining, right? So, to be honest with you, bargaining deep, and this is my interpretation, and I think it is the interpretation, but bargaining dependent terrorism is actually better than, it's a better state of affairs than bargaining independent terrorism, which is the last form, right? So then the last form would be bargaining, and I'll just, bargaining independent, right? Bargaining independent terrorism, right? Bargaining independent terrorism, an approach to terrorism wherein perpetrators, they do not seek to bargain with those in power. There is no attempt to bargain with those in power, but they use violence as a tool of perpetrating fear. For example, bombings, mass killings, mass poisoning, so on. As you can see, bargaining dependent terrorism in the grand scale is a better state of affairs to have to deal with than bargaining independent terrorism. Why? Because in bargaining dependent terrorism, there's an opportunity to save lives. There's an opportunity to intervene on behalf of those targeted. There's an opportunity, right? So in bargaining dependent, opportunity, OPP, how do you spell it? I've just blanked out. OPP-ERTUNITY. Opportunities exist in bargaining dependent terrorist activities. Opportunities do not exist. Opportunity does not exist, right? Opportunity does not exist in bargaining independent terrorist acts. For example, mass killings, genocide, obviously, mass poisoning, etc., etc., right? Me, as a conflict resolutionist, as a genocide scholar, My main interest is in tackling bargaining independent forms of terrorism, genocide being probably the greatest instantiation of bargaining independent terrorist activity, if you want to discuss genocide as a form of terrorism, which very few people have done, but which I'm interested in doing. As a form of bargaining independent terrorism, genocide is extremely effective in spreading fear, right? When you hear that 800,000 people were massacred with machetes by armed, basically civilians, in the course of 3 to 4 weeks, if that doesn't elicit fear, I don't know what does, right? That gross negligence and refusal to acknowledge the sanctity of human life is problematic for interventionists, right? There is no negotiator involved in bargaining independent terrorism. There is no need for a negotiator. The only way to curb bargaining independent terrorism or bargaining independent acts of genocide is prevention and education. That really is the only way, because there's nothing that can pacify that bloodlust that the organization has. That organization wants to kill these people, and that organization will kill these people under any circumstance, and there's nothing that can be said to pacify the organization's desire to slaughter those people or the targeted group. The only way then to be able to try and attempt to curb that is prior to the acquisition of that desire. Prior to me recognizing that I actually do want to kill these people, I, as a preventionist, as a peace builder, have to make sure that, humanization in a Freirean sense is always at the forefront. Recognize the humanity of these people. Make sure you remember that they're just like me. It sounds very, very trivial, but that's all we really have. And all of the publications and all of the journals and all of the books that are ever written and will ever be written, in the end, that's all that it comes down to, right? You need to recognize that we're the same people, right? Dehumanization results in sort of this bloodlust, this desire. And once it gets to that, once it becomes bargaining independent, there's nothing that can be done, right? There's nothing that can be done at that point. So in a scale sort of rating, bargaining dependent terrorism is a better state of affairs, the best of two evils, than a bargaining independent, right? Dependent better than independent, both horrible, but there's at least an opportunity in bargaining independent terrorist activities to prevent the terrorist act. There's a point of note that I'm going to make here on page 2. Note the difference between bargaining dependent and bargaining independent terrorism is not contingent on the nature of the terrorist act, but on the intent to act, right? It's not contingent on what actually happens. People can be killed in bargaining dependent terrorism. The same number of people can be killed in the same manner in bargaining independent, right? The distinction, and this is very, very important, between dependent and independent terrorism, bargaining dependent and bargaining independent terrorism, is the intent of the perpetrator. In bargaining dependent terrorism, the perpetrator has the intent that he or she will entertain intervention, right? So that negotiation becomes possible. And they know that before the activity. I'm willing to negotiate because I want something. And my desire is contingent on some negotiation, right? The activity might be the same number of people might die in the same manner as in bargaining independent. The difference, however, in bargaining independent, I just want to kill those people. There's nothing that you can say, there's nothing that you can give me that will dissuade me from my intent to destroy these people. So that's the main difference, right? That's a very, very, very important point. It wasn't specifically addressed in the readings, but I wanted to make sure that I communicated that. So I give an example. Let me do this so my ink doesn't run out. For example, a hijacking can be considered bargaining dependent, obviously, if the hostages are used as collateral in seeking some end, right? So if I hijack a plane, the hostages are used in seeking asylum, in seeking monetary resources, what have you, then my activity becomes bargaining dependent. However, as in the case of 9/11, hijacking can be considered a form of bargaining independent terrorism, since there was never any intent to release the hostages, right? So the exact same act, it's very clear, right? That should be crystal clear, right? The exact same act, taking hostages, can both be considered bargaining dependent or bargaining independent. What you need to know as an analyst or just a student is the intent of the hijacker. If the hijacker wants something that can be potentially negotiated, then the hijacking becomes a bargaining dependent act of terrorism. terrorism because there's something that can be that can satiate the desire. If, like in September 11th, the intent of the hijacking is to kill all of the passengers regardless of what happens, then the activity becomes bargaining independent because there's nothing that can be given to the hijackers to pacify their desire to kill the targets. So irrespective of the act, hijacking, it can be either bargaining dependent or independent. It's the intent of the hijacker, of the perpetrator, that's important.